Welcome to Vermont Voices. I'm Sharice Madigan, and today we're joined by Vermont's own Lieutenant Governor, David Zuckerman. Thank you so much for joining me today and coming all the way down south.
Happy to.
Great. So my first question, I'm so excited to be here with a studio audience today, and I'm sure they have lots of questions for you as well, so I'll keep mine fairly brief. But I know that you did run on a platform of economic justice, which is something that's of great interest to me and can kind of manifest itself in a myriad of ways. Sure. So tell me a little bit about that platform and how it's evolved over the last year you've been in office.
Was very interested in and continue to be interested in the issue of the disparate economic scenario that we have in our country at this point. The wealthier folks continue to get wealthier at a rate much faster than working class people's situations are unfolding. And it's true from wages, it's true with the cost of health care and the challenges for a lot of folks to be able to afford health care. We're doing that better in Vermont than a lot of places, although right now we're all nervous about what's happening federally. For the moment, we've sort of dodged a bullet. I think with the current Trump administration, they may find other ways to try to squeeze the resources going to Medicaid, which supports a lot of our healthcare scenario. And just in general, the rural economy is always tough. It's tough in Vermont. It's tough in states all across the country. And part of being a spokesperson in the role that I am as Lieutenant Governor is making sure also to sometimes put things in perspective, because sometimes there's a discussion of Vermont is really struggling, and it's because of certain regulations or circumstances that we put on as government. But when you actually look at rural economies throughout the country, rural states anywhere, rural scenarios are hurting. And so now what can we do to change that? And there are a number of different things I think we can do. We didn't really get across the finish line with very many of them. One is addressing the minimum wage and really setting a path to continue to make steady progress and increasing it, preferably towards, in my opinion, $15 an hour. But that's a point to talk about, but it should just be a steady increase over a number of years to make sure the working poor and working class people always benefit as the economy continues to expand and not just have it accumulate to the wealthiest. That discussion was started, but we didn't really get where we need to go. Healthcare, there's a bill in around universal primary care. And we're fortunate in Vermont, again, we have about 97% of Vermonters have health insurance of one form or another. But that is not really complete. First of all, there's some people that don't have any. But also, if we move towards a universal primary care system and people really understood and felt and experienced a universal system in part, then we could continue to move on our way towards a complete universal system. And a universal primary care system would not have the price tag challenge that our universal system as a whole had under the Shumlin administration that we passed in 2010, but would help create savings, because a lot of folks don't go to their doctor until things become acute, and that's when it becomes far more expensive. And so if we had universal primary care and folks could regularly see their primary care doctor when first ailments started to occur, when we could catch diabetes earlier, when we could have regular checkups and maybe catch cancer at earlier moments and stages, we could actually save a lot of money in our healthcare system instead of having it be emergency room costs. So there's I think going to be a long way to go on economic justice. It's a very big topic, but those conversations are happening, and hopefully we can continue to make progress in the next session.
Great. And tell me a little bit about your first year as Lieutenant Governor and this past legislative session that just ended.
I really enjoyed it. That's sort of a part anybody wants in a job, I suppose, but it isn't just a job. It's really being the town moderator of the Senate is a large part of the position, and during the session, that seemed to go well. I think my colleagues in the Senate, I really enjoyed working with Senators Campion and Senator Sears, both on a number of issues, but also at times checking in with them about the process of the Senate, which seems like a sort of mundane topic, but in this day and age, again, with our new president, I think the process of government, the process of democracy, the process of public engagement is critical, almost now more than ever, that to remind us that we are representatives of people. I call myself a publicly elected official more often than a politician. I think that grounds me in what my position is and helps remind those who I'm talking to that it's the people of the state that ought to have the ideas and the power in the process, and not just the people that can be in Montpelier all the time, lobbyists or folks maybe that have economic circumstances that allow them to be there. And that's where that process is so important. Folks calling in, folks sending in emails. I put out a newsletter every 2 to 4 weeks during the session talking about issues. If anybody wants that newsletter, they can go to the Lieutenant Governor's website and sign up for it. And the more people call, the more people engage with their legislators, the more those voices will matter in the deliberative process of policymaking. And that went really well. I got a lot of positive feedback from that newsletter. So the senators seemed to like how I did the job as the quote town moderator, as the presiding officer, and a lot of folks gave good feedback about getting those newsletters and participating in the process.
Great to see community engagement.
Yeah.
And what are your hopes for next year?
Well, certainly I was disappointed in the end with a couple different issues. One being how the budget sort of got roiled up at the very end, and I hope that just, again, from a process perspective, we don't have any last minute curveballs like that. I think there's real opportunity in Vermont when there's good ideas for saving money and or building the economy or working on clean water to put an idea out there, bring everybody to the table and work it through the process. So one thing is to make sure we don't have that kind of unfortunate political battles that are tossed in at the end as a little bit of a surprise move. I've been a long time advocate of cannabis reform, which I think is something that would both help our rural economy, when we were talking about economic justice earlier and the challenges of our rural areas, but also I think that's an issue of social justice and a way to improve our drug challenges, frankly, because we have learned that pushing drugs under the table and into the underground doesn't necessarily get them not used. Back in the 30s, it was clear, 20s and 30s, that alcohol underground did not work. It just created criminals, it created an economic system for people to make money without any regulation and then crime. And we're seeing that with cannabis as well, maybe not quite as much crime and as much violence, which is fortunate. But bringing that above board would be both economically beneficial, it would draw tourists into our ski areas, but also it would bring that economy above board so people would pay their fair share of taxes. And ultimately, last I checked, drug dealers don't ask young people for an ID. Are you 21? You know, they don't have any quality control on the product. They get something in from someone, it could be laced with another drug. It could be, I've heard people actually grind little bits of lead into it to make a bag heavier because you sell it by weight. And then people are consuming it through smoking, which is an awful thing to consider, that people would be smoking in lead, other drugs. So a better regulated product, in my mind, and having it above board is a far more sane way to have that system. We would have resources for law enforcement on the roads, not only for drugged driving, but also texting while driving. I appreciate that the governor is concerned about people driving under the impairment of cannabis, but they're doing it right now, and we don't have enough people on the road to monitor for it. And far more common is people driving and texting, and we've seen people weaving and dangers of that. So put more law enforcement on the road to address any unsafe driving. So to me, delaying that is detrimental to both youth prevention, safer roads, and economic development, while other states around us will be reaping the economic benefit of having it above board, when right now Vermont has the opportunity to be a leader in that regard. Healthcare, again, I'd like to see us move somewhere on universal primary care. We did see a bill move in the House around paid family leave. It put all of the burden on the employees. I'd like to see a little bit more of a mixture of where the cost of that system will be paid for. We'd like to see that move forward. As a small business owner, I run a farm. In fact, right now we're struggling to find employees. It's actually really, there's a dearth of employees out there, potential workers. And I get that the wages will impact the business. But I can't produce anything without workers. My business can't survive without 10 to 12 people every summer. And so if we can raise wages a little bit and attract more people into some of these jobs, and they all will then have better resource scenarios to then buy the products that we make in Vermont. The cost of my food will not go up at the rate of the pay to my employees, because more people buy my food than just minimum wage workers. And I think that's true of many low wage jobs, is that that cost gets spread out over a broader spectrum, And again, the other part of that is the costs then go down for our society. If our low-wage workers are making better pay, then we would have less need for state subsidies on their health care or their child care or their housing. And so we have this scenario where by keeping wages depressed, we actually have to have higher revenues for the state from everybody to pay to keep people in the social norms and values that we value, which is that nobody should be living in poverty. People shouldn't be living in decrepit housing. And if we keep wages too low, that's what happens. So I'd like to see us work on minimum wage and health care and paid family leave.
Yeah, those are some great goals. And I know we've got a large studio audience, so rather than asking more questions from me, I'd love to hear from the audience and hear what they have to say.
Sure.
Great.
Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for coming.
My question is, what has been the most unexpected experience you have had as Lieutenant Governor?
The most unexpected experience. Well, I would say actually it isn't on the policy side or the process, because having served for 14 years in the House prior to a couple years off when we finally were able to buy land and move my farm, and then 4 years in the Senate, the process and policies, there were no major surprises. One of the more interesting things was out at public events, I had never had a shadow, someone actually following me around, filming me, and taking that film for political purposes. And I met this person at my Friday coffee hour, which I have every Friday morning during the session. Any constituent from across the state can come in. I provide coffee and biscuits and a chat and listen to whatever issues are on people's minds. And this person was filming me, and I asked what it was for. And at first he just said personal use. But eventually, after seeing him at 3 or 4 events and talking to him a little more, he was being paid by the Republican Governors Association to take footage of me just doing my job, speaking to people, open coffee hour or at public events. And certainly free speech, anybody can film it, and that's fine, but that was a surprise to me. In Vermont, we don't really play politics that way. We ask people questions directly. We say who we are if people ask questions, and for the first couple times, I had to kind of work it out of him. But so that was a surprise. It's a new level of politics in that regard. I'm lieutenant governor. I'm a bigger figure, I guess, than I was as a senator. So that wasn't a big issue from a policy perspective, but that was the biggest surprise.
Thanks as well.
Absolutely.
I've been trying to figure out how to get to your Friday things other than I have to leave here at 5 in the morning.
Yeah, it's a long way.
Yeah, okay, kind of two-part if you don't mind. Immigration, how are you guys dealing with this in Vermont as we're watching the borders flow with people and people actually literally being uprooted from their homes and families and lives?
And that's the first part, or is that both
Well,
parts
that's
of
the
question?
first part.
Okay, what's the
which-
second part of the question?
Oh, okay.
That's okay.
Second part is, how is everybody trying to keep people interested in digging into politics? Okay, I mean, this was a hard year. We're all dug in. We went to rallies, we went to this, we pledged, we did 100 things. It always
Right.
seems to come down to money. And then it's always like, well, if you're interested in politics, get involved. Well, people get involved, and then they spend their money, and then they don't get elected. So I think it's really distressing.
Yep.
I find it really, really hard to even encourage people, because you spend a lot of time and money, as you know. You drive all over the state,
Right.
and people, they back you up, they give you money, they have parties for, all this stuff happens. And then the day after election, you see the little list.
Right.
It's hard.
Okay. So
That was a 10-part.
Oh, that's fine. Well, two different things. Certainly, Governor Scott, I appreciate his leadership in drawing together a group of the Attorney General, myself. I think he brought the Speaker and the Pro Tem's office in as well. Law enforcement, agriculture, a couple other agencies. I don't remember. Everybody was at the table to really look at the initial Trump presidency executive order around Syrian refugees and or just refugees in general, with respect to immigration. And we wrote a law and supported a law that he signed that would make it so that any local or state or statewide law enforcement could not enter into agreements with the federal law enforcement to carry out immigration service work without the governor's approval. And that goal was to, because oftentimes there are grants or agreements made with local law enforcement working with FBI or others without that restriction. And so with respect to immigration, we passed a law that local and state would not. We are somewhat limited because a lot of federal boundaries of our country, law enforcement is federal jurisdiction. So there's a limit to what we can do there. I know the Agency of Agriculture has done some work with, quote, contingency plans if some of the workers on dairy farms are uprooted and removed from dairy farms. A lot of that contingency is more about the economics of the dairy farm and the dairy farmer, not as much about the employees and workers on the farm. And there's a lot of work being done around that with Migrant Justice and other organizations, both in terms of trying to prepare those individuals with how to reach out for legal services and protections, and how to work to maybe get more of them a better status to be able to work here. And there's work being done with Ben & Jerry's, frankly, and others, where there's both pressure and work from within at Ben & Jerry's trying to come to some method of better compensation for farmers or coverage so that the workers also get paid better and are working under better conditions, because it's not only immigration status, but then with that, sometimes there's worker conditions that are not always as good as they could otherwise be. It's a really hard one. I know that the federal delegation is working hard at the national level to try to thwart or adjust any policies that the administration may be presenting. But this is one of the many, many challenges they're fighting on the national level that I think many Vermonters are sort of aghast at with respect to the current presidency and the actions that he's taking on a range of issues. With respect to engagement, that's sort of one of the hallmarks and things that I most care about as a whole. I think our system, I was incredibly cynical about our political system back in 1992 before I met, when I was at UVM, when I heard about this Bernie Sanders guy who was, our congressman at the time. And he really inspired me as a young person that politics wasn't all about money. It didn't have to be all about corporate power. And I think in many respects, his campaign, did for many across the country what happened for me and many in Vermont, many, many years ago and over the last, 25, 30 years. And I am certainly no Bernie Sanders, but my hope is to also go around. I'm talking with a lot of young people. I go to a lot of high schools. I have a youth initiative. I did a program on public television, bringing young people on about how are they getting involved in their community, from business and jobs, nonprofits, what they do in their spare time. And we had a great discussion. And my sort of, I guess, inspirational aspect to fatigue would be at the 4 million odd people that came out the day after Trump's inauguration, that it's not all on any one of our shoulders, right? 4 million people came out across the country. In Montpelier, we had one of the biggest rallies in anybody's memory, maybe almost ever. We shut down 3 exits of the highway. We are not alone. And I think sometimes we get that feeling, you're on the phone at home alone, or you're at your computer signing on a petition, and you're like, is this really doing anything? It is. The healthcare bill that failed in Washington failed because people were calling. And even many of those senators, and frankly, some of those House members who ultimately voted for it, they knew they were not voting for what their constituents wanted. That is not a result that happened just because. That happened because hundreds of thousands and probably millions of people did pick up the phone, did call. And I think the silver lining of this election of this person as president is really maybe, for me, a hope that we now have a 20 to 30 year bank of never again, and that people will be engaging. And I can tell you a lot of people are calling my office, and the newsletter that I put out, the first day I put it out, I always put in there how to contact your legislator, and here's some issues that are coming. The very first day it came out, 3 different senators came to my office and said, so I hear you're putting out a newsletter these days. And I thought, yes, indeed, I have, and that's perfect. And if more would call from that, I've offered actually to the leadership of all three parties that if they have something they want to put in the newsletter from their perspective, I'm happy to do that. It doesn't have to be all David Zuckerman's perspective, but if they have an issue they want my email list to hear about, let the people decide, let them call. So those calls and those efforts are not futile. Running for office is a different matter. What I've said in general is, you make 30 minutes, 2 or 3 days a week to go running or to play bridge with your friends or to do activities. Just budget 15 or 30 minutes a week for democracy, for those phone calls, for those emails, for getting together to talk. Running for office is another matter. That's a much bigger commitment. It's a harder thing to do, but it's something that people should consider doing. And I just saw a statistic the other day that nationally at this point, only 15 to 30 people have filed to challenge Democrats or Republicans, either side, for U.S. Congress. And by filing, they will have had to have raised $5,000. This year, over 200 people have at this point in time. So that's 8-10 times the norm. So people are engaged. Now, I'm not encouraging everyone to run for Congress. I think our congressman's pretty darn good and our senators are great. But that's happening also, you start at the local level, the school boards, your select boards, your fence viewers, all those commissions, they matter. And I think people have sort of, because of media and otherwise, think it only matters who's governor and lieutenant governor and who's president and vice president in Congress. A lot of those decisions are made locally, and it's also where people learn about sitting across the table from people with different views and figure out how to come up with solutions that will work, that don't really rile everybody up, but actually really impact people on a day-to-day level. So getting involved in those ways is a great way to explore public service outside of the phone calls and the emails.
As a member of the majority party, would you approve of a mandatory civics course taught in Vermont's public schools?
Well, it's interesting. In some respects, I would think that would be part of your social studies and history classes. So I don't know that I would necessarily support mandating that. I think there's a lot of mandates in our schools, and a lot of teachers and our education system as a whole is more and more constrained. And what we have been doing, I think there's been this incredible pressure on moving towards STEM, which is valuable in one respect, certainly, but I want well-rounded individuals to come out of our schools. I want folks who are critical thinkers to come out of our schools. I want folks who are financially literate and civically literate to come out of our schools. To do that through a strict mandatory system is probably a little bit past where I would want to be, but certainly talking about it regularly and encouraging that conversation, not only in our schools, but in our homes. Civics starts long before kids even get to school. My daughter went with me to vote, every year since she's been born, either with me or my spouse or both. She sometimes went twice, right? I only voted once, my wife only voted once, but she got to see it twice since apparently voter fraud is this rampant problem. I'll leave it at that. But so civics is really both about what we do in our homes and how we talk about issues in our homes, and also how we as political leaders address each other and how we have these conversations and discussions, and that we stay focused on issues and not on personal character assault and assassination. Does it preclude the ability to point out differences and have challenging conversations? No, but the civility in politics really is sadly wanting. At the national level in particular, where you have this just TV ad world where it's all about attacking the other in order to get people to despise the other person so much that they're willing to vote for you. I happen to think that doesn't really say a whole lot about yourself. If the only way you think you can win is to have the other person be so much worse than you are. So I think it's really on all of us to do that and not so much on a mandated government system.
Thank you very much for being here.
Sure.
My question has been addressed by two previous people.
Okay.
I'm part of a group of women who have been very, very interested in finding out what's happening in our local educational organizations, our schools, to find out what's actually being taught and what kind of priority around civics, and we're calling it Civics Literacy. We're going to actually have a panel of educators. There'll be 4 or 5 of them next Thursday at 7 o'clock at the North Shore Bookstore to tell us what they're teaching and how they're teaching it, how effective it is, what challenges they have, and how we as a community can support them. I personally also have the question about what kind of position and priority can the state make civics, because I feel that a lot of people, and we've been told this, many of the young people who are in college even are apathetic. They don't believe that government has a role in their lives, and B, that the people feel very negative, that the government is trying to control them. They have no ability to respond. So to me, I think the time is now. We're in a huge heightened awareness. It's nationally, people are being very well recognized that the education of what's happening in democracy and how it works is not being addressed, and nobody knows. 2/3 of the people don't know that there are 3 branches of government. To me, it's now that we need, as a state, to stand up and work towards civics literacy.
Well, if I can be so uncivil to say that I'm not sure our president recognizes that there's 3 branches of government. That the courts aren't supposed to do whatever he or she wants. That Congress isn't supposed to just pass whatever he or she, in this case, he says, and that's clearly a problem. And the president has a following of people that certainly think in the same way. What I've been encouraged by is that actually the vast majority of this country, far more than the majority that also didn't vote for him, but even beyond that, are less and less approving of that system of thinking and that leadership. One of the challenges that we face, however, is also our schools are perceived as part of government. So you've got a little bit of a challenge there if you say this will be mandated through government, through the schools, that there's a group of people that will then say, see, they're even trying to brainwash you this way. Now, I think that's a minority. But I think we have to be both vigilant. I think that event you're having is fantastic. And I've sometimes told folks that sometimes it's not just the event, but it's the marketing of the event. It's the information about the event that also has an effect. Because not everybody's going to go, but people are going to see those signs that say, we're having a conversation about civics and government. And none of us learn everything or change with a one-off, right? It isn't you go to one event and all of a sudden you've changed and your mind is opened in some form or another and you just change who you are and how you think. But if we see people holding these kinds of events, you see signs up a couple times, you then maybe watch this program and see how we can have a rational, pleasant conversation about differences or whatnot. You see people having discourse in a positive civic way. Those are the things that are going to impact people over time. I would also say, with our friend from the journalistic world, that what we demand of our journalists is critically important. What we see on TV, what we read in the paper, is partly determined by the editors and the owners of those outlets who are trying to make money and pay the bills. And that is done through what the people buy. And if sensationalist news is what sells, then that's what they're going to do. If controversy is what sells, that's what they're going to do. Many years ago, probably 10, 12 years ago, near the end of the session, I asked the House clerk when I was serving in the House, how many bills, what percentage of bills come out of committee in a nonpartisan way? Fairly unanimous or one dissenting vote, but not all of this party versus all of that party. 92% of the bills in Montpelier came out either unanimously or with one dissenting vote. 4% had 2 dissenting votes. And it was only the remaining 6%, or no, 4%, that had a real divide coming out of committee. But you would not know that. you hear about the 6 or 8 controversial bills. Now, it's not to say media should just go, well, let's just write about the really boring stuff all the time. But if they had written that, there were these other bills that also happened that weren't, other than like the state vegetable, which is this fun thing to write about. But there's a lot of time in legislation where we take moderately difficult topics and we come up with compromises and we make adjustments and we move the dial one way or another and see how it works for a few years, and then we do it again. But most people don't realize that that's really most of what happens, and it's a handful of bills that are hot topics, and that's fair. Legalizing cannabis. Some people, it's a hot topic. It's a big change. Big change is going to have disruption and conversation. That's a good thing. But most of the time, it's pretty civic. So I think we have to lead as political figures, as community members, as families, in how to have those conversations, as well as improve it in our schools, work with our social studies teachers to really talk about U.S. history, our democratic process. It's not all white men, although I happen to be, et cetera, so that people understand that this system is for everybody.
Well, first of all, welcome to the Shires.
It's great to be here.
Thank you. And also, thank you for your service. I think we spend a lot of time thanking the military for their service, and we forget to thank public leaders like you that commit time and effort and energy and your own resources to lead our governments. So I'm appreciative of the fact that you've gotten over your cynicism and moved into an area of engagement. Mm-hmm. My question is really about the energy industry. It's really one of the last areas in our mechanisms here where we can democratize it, where we can provide producers and consumers on a peer-to-peer network. And we're seeing this across the country as solar and energy policy is moving to a place where it's being disintermediated, like Uber or Airbnb. We have producers at a micro level consuming and moving that energy through to a macro level or to the rest of the people. It also is a way to make low and moderate income people money in that process. I'm wondering, with the real rapid changes in energy policy that we're seeing nationwide, how Vermont is going to address this in the days ahead.
Well, I appreciate the question, and I think energy touches on also probably one of the biggest issues of our time, which is climate change. So it's both an economic justice issue, it's also an economic security issue, that if you have centralized power with long lines moving it, those are easily interrupted. So there are businesses that rely on reliable power that could be disrupted. And obviously, I think it's a climate issue as well. And as a farmer who has been challenged by this extraordinarily wet season, the last couple of weeks notwithstanding, and thankfully turning a corner, these are all major issues. I will say I was pleased with the governor with respect to his immediate response to the president pulling out of the climate accord. But at the same time, he also appointed someone to the Public Service Board who is, I believe, chair of the Public Service Board, who has a more critical eye with respect to some of the renewable energy projects and potential in the state. So there was a little bit of a I'm happy, but that same day I'm unhappy scenario with that. So as the state goes, there's really two arenas where those decisions are going to happen. One is the governor's decision with respect to who's running the regulations. And that's really up to the governor. That's not my position to make those decisions. And so I can just say so far, the governor made a position that's a little more restrictive in all likelihood, or it appears to be. From a policy perspective, the legislature can draw up policies and still push for either goals or beyond goals, which tend to be kind of nebulous, actual policy. What is the net metering rate? How much net metering can there be? What are the incentives? And this year was a bit of a flat year with respect to creativity. And I think that's probably for a number of reasons. Some is we've been fairly forward-moving, more than most states with respect to renewable energy on a policy perspective. And with the election of this governor, with the election of this president, and with the discussion around the state, there was just a little bit of a pause with new leadership everywhere. I'm hoping that we hit the ground running a little bit more next year with more creativity around local distributed power. Some of these things are going to take a few years to shift because we have this hub and spoke system of big production and big transmission lines, and there are adjustments that need to be made as you're putting power on and off in various places. But hopefully, I think energy is one of the top issues, but not just energy we use for these lights, but also energy we use to move ourselves around. And I think one arena where we really need to look at, and it also deals with economic justice, is public transportation. Because right now, a lot of folks rely on cars to get to work 20, 40, 60 miles away in this state. And we have both the emissions engine light issue that is rearing up right now, that a lot of low-income people can't afford vehicles that will meet the standards that need to be moved around. And we have the energy consumption and fossil fuel scenario that single occupancy vehicles use versus public transportation, which if we had better public transportation would also be an economic benefit for more working class people who can't afford a vehicle to get around. So there's a lot of ways to address this, and I don't have all the answers. And back to public input, creative ideas don't just come from the 180 legislators and the governor and myself. They come from everybody out there, all of you. And so reaching out to your legislator, your House member, your senator, and if they're not receptive because they might have a different view on the issue, then you can always call another one. I mean, any legislator can introduce legislation, so if you can get the good idea in front of somebody who will do it, that's welcome.
Can you stand up?
Oh, sure. Thank you once again for meeting with us.
Thank you.
Many families in this area have been devastated by the opiate epidemic, and my family included. Getting help in Vermont has been impossible. And with the president making this a public health crisis in the past, or just as of yesterday, I'd like to know how we're going to follow up and get people in Vermont the care that they need, long-term care that they need and deserve.
Wow. Well, thank you for bringing it up, and I'm sorry for your connection to that. I suspect many people watching and many people in this room have a connection in some form or another. I had an employee who had to leave the state and went to Florida for treatment, which was fortunately beneficial. I think he's doing a lot better with his partner and their newborn, but it also didn't exactly help the business either. And so it's affecting people, family, it's affecting people in their community. It's a lot of crime to meet the addiction and the cost of the addiction, and it's affecting our businesses. So I appreciate the question. It's really poignant. I have not received any documentation or sort of what it means with respect to the president's declaration. I also don't know that the administration yet knows what that declaration means, unfortunately, to be so cynical about this president. But I hope that it means resources and collaboration and opportunities to expand treatment. What's frightening is, as hard as it is to get help in Vermont, we're actually doing better than most other states. Governor Shumlin went out on a limb long before, and people criticized him for it. Said, "Oh, you don't want to draw this attention to Vermont." Well, he drew attention to a problem and started us down a path of some help. But we don't have the resources we need. And what's curious, and I'm sorry to circle back to this, but one of the top priorities I would do with cannabis revenue is have full funding. I mean, the revenue stream really would provide full funding for both short-term and long-term treatment and some economic development, opportunities to get people back on their feet. There just isn't a lot of money out there. As much money as the state does collect, we provide a lot of different services, and they're important services, but we don't have the resources we need. One of the things I'd like to see us do, and this is related to education as well, and I talked about this for years when I was on the Education Committee, and Secretary Gobet from Human Services and Secretary Holcomb from Education are starting to have these conversations, partly because we put it in law and partly because they both want to have these conversations, is to bring an element of our Human Services Administration into our schools. Because there's a school in every town, or close to it. And you have guidance counselors in the schools. And the schools are a familiar place for everyone. It's sort of often a community hub. Why not have better access to the human services resources in the state instead of having places that might be 20 or 30 or 40 miles away for some folks? Have an officer, not a police officer, but a human services person in every school, where right now only some schools have that. And so our teachers sometimes are being social workers when instead they could be spending more time teaching civics and teaching math and teaching all the different things that we would hope they could teach. They're actually managing a classroom full of chaos sometimes. And have that piece of that job go back to being the job of social workers and support staff that our schools can't afford because it's paid for through the property tax system, which even with our adjustments for income is still a challenge for a lot, so we can't raise revenues through school budgets to pay for those resources. And yet we're paying for it already through human services. So why pay for it twice? Let's see where we can merge those services together, save some money, and either then have more resources to provide, but also more resources to have local access for families that are struggling to find out, where do I get the help? How do I get the help? The other piece is that long-term support, because a lot of folks with opiate challenges get a 1 week or a 1 month treatment scenario, and then they're kicked back out to fend for themselves. And we've learned clearly that this is a long-term addiction and challenge. And I know there's also, back to cannabis, there's a lot of research going into cannabis as a treatment method. Low THC varieties, but they're both deal with the same part of your body's physical chemistry. And one, sets you in a state of being that isn't productive and keeps you from being productive, and then draws you in again and again, and you've got to steal to get the money for it. The other can calm your body's physical need, but allow you to be mentally and physically capable of being a productive person. The low THC, high cannabinoid varieties. And so there's really good research going into that may be an opportunity rather than the pharmaceutical industry solutions to everything, which I think, frankly, is, along with climate change, one of the biggest issues in our society is how dependent we are on pharmaceuticals, which is what's led to, frankly, the opioid crisis.
One last question.
All right, so my question is also about the opioid crisis. I was born in Vermont, and I grew up in the very small town of Londonderry, just over the mountain, where just recently we had 2 deaths due to overdoses, in two separate areas, a woman in her 40s and a young man who was 20 years old who I knew growing up. And just throwing it out there, I mean, it's not necessarily the most popular idea, but I was just curious to know if the state has ever considered using a clean needle program or a safe house program where someone can go who's going to use, and they're going to use anyway, and do it in a safe environment where they can have the things that are needed in case it has a substance like fentanyl in the drug, where they can be revived essentially when they overdose, or somewhere where they can go use, because again they're going to continue to use, but also talk to somebody about getting help somewhere, because otherwise they're either going to have to get help via a court order or seek it out themselves, and in many cases people are just so addicted that they're not going to find that help, and it'll be too late eventually. So I'm just curious, even though it's an unpopular idea in many cases, if that's ever been considered at the state level.
Well, 2 things. I believe there's a representative from Burlington who introduced a bill around safe haven and has started that conversation. So the idea is now out there. And I know that she took some flack for it, both from colleagues, and I think there were some media stories about it. And it takes sort of a brave politician to put that out there to start that conversation. So I applaud her for starting that conversation. Really what it comes down to is, first, the shift in the public around whether this is a criminal matter or whether it is a health matter. And many of us, I think, and it is shifting this way, to recognizing this is a health issue, not a criminal issue. The criminal element is an offshoot of the health problem. It's not the other way around. And so if we can start addressing it as a health issue and talking about it as a health issue, then I think this kind of conversation or other creative ideas, I don't know what the perfect solution is, will come out of those conversations and will come out of that collective wisdom that we have across the state. So I appreciate you bringing it up, and that's what needs to happen. More people need to bring it up. I know in South Burlington, when there was just a discussion of a methadone clinic, which is the people that have come to a place where they're ready to say, I have a problem and I need a daily support system so that I can function in society and no longer continue to have the addiction through this underground terrible way. Even those folks were fought against by many members of the local community. Now, ultimately, the clinic went in, but that was a hugely controversial scenario, much less a scenario where it says, oh, you can come here to consume the drug safely. So I think the conversations need to happen a lot more. I think we need to continue to move this forward with respect to it being a health problem, and that addiction can happen to anybody. And I think one thing that today's conversation and many others that I've had with people all across the state is it doesn't matter if you're Republican or Democrat, progressive or independent. It doesn't matter if you're wealthy or you're poor. There's no demographic that says, oh, these people do heroin and nobody else does, therefore we can demonize them. As more folks realize this is across the board, I think the more these conversations can happen in a rational way. It just, I lost my train of thought, but the fact that it affects everyone is going to be what changes this conversation, for sure.
Should we stop there? Great.
I'll try to answer quickly so we can get to you as well.
Words don't seem to do it. I find out action does. We have expired, in my eyes, almost. Why do we have an exodus from young people? Because we have no jobs. We have no work, no jobs, and problems are kicked under the table by higher-ups. So consequently, we have these sad stories, and I want to thank you for coming down here to listen to me. That's quite a thing. My wife doesn't either. But I can laugh at myself, but I do see
all
and
have to laugh
I
at
do
ourselves.
see and
That's a
hear
good start.
things, and I listen to some of the problems that our young people and people in general here in Vermont have. It's very, very sad. And I'm not here to make a dissertation. You can, but not I. But our problems are severe, and I think we've reached the end of the rope. I really do. And it's sad to say that,
Right.
but we cannot lose any more young people to North Dakota and South Dakota with all those jobs, and have New Hampshire flourishing and Pennsylvania flourishing and so forth. We need help. And welfare is not going to do it. We're the laughing stock of the country. Thank you for listening.
Sure. Well, a couple things on that. One is, I would say, outside of the Dakotas with the oil shale boom, et cetera, and even that has waned some. If you actually characterize a state as a whole, a Pennsylvania or a New Hampshire, if you look at them, the populated areas may well be doing fine. The rural areas are not. It is not actually a welfare state or policy regard in that respect. It really is an urban-rural issue, and it's happening both in this country and, frankly, around the world. With the world of phones, which I think I set mine aside, and the access to the world that young people have, it's a more interesting world to go where all the action is. And yes, that's related to jobs as well, because where people go, then you have to build houses, and then you've got the foment. That's a positive build, no doubt about it. But it isn't the, quote, welfare state or the regulatory policies that are actually making Vermont worse off than anywhere else. If you actually look at most rural areas, we're doing better than many of them. And what we have an opportunity, as far as the end of the line or not, Vermont's situation geographically, close to the Northeast megalopolis, puts us in a much better position than the Iowas and the Nebraskas and so forth, because we do, and we're shifting our economy with tourism, with people that live in those places but then realize I don't want to be surrounded by cement all the time. And they actually value, as they then get into their mid-30s and 40s, a world that isn't completely buildings. And they either come here to then raise their families if they can find work, and or to recreate. And that's where our ski areas are, you know that in this area as well in terms of what tourism means for our economy, and where our microbrews, where I would argue our cannabis system could also draw people up. We're not the manufacturing businesses anymore of 20, 30, 50 years ago. But that's not just Vermont. That's across the country. We exported it to China and Bangladesh and Mexico a long time ago. That's not Vermont policy. That's US policy and global economics. And as long as we want to play that game, we will do that. You look at socialized countries like Sweden and Norway, their young people are thriving. They have universal health care. They have a support system in that regard that works quite well. And it doesn't concentrate the wealth in the hands of a few. There's different philosophies about how that works, but overall, it seems to be working pretty well in many of those countries.
And here I am. First, I want to thank you for being an elected official.
Thank you. Wow, a couple of those. I appreciate it. But thank you for being here.
As opposed to a politician. I would like to bring the topic back to the opiate crisis.
Okay.
And I actually don't have a question. I'd like to make a plug. We are four mothers, one is not present, that have organized a rally in conjunction with the International Overdose Awareness that's taking place on August 31st. And in Manchester at the Factory Point Green, we will have a rally. There's going to be resources, Narcan for people who want to learn how to use it, and resources for treatment. There'll also be music and a candlelight vigil for those that we have lost to this epidemic. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And back to your comment earlier, maybe to wrap it up, in that that's what civic engagement is. It isn't always through laws. It isn't always through policies and commissions. It's also about community just simply coming together. And one of the things that I love about Vermont, and just a couple nights ago, I was up in Hardwick at their community music night. There were like 500 people out every Tuesday night in the summer for 8 or 9 weeks. Food vendors, musician, again, all stripes, all ages. That's the fabric. That's what is going to keep us going. That's what's part of the community and civics. Law enforcement was there, but few people had beers. They weren't cracking down on them, but they were saying be moderate and responsible about it. It's that sensibility, and it's people coming together, hosting events like this to say, we're going to tackle this locally as well as through policy changes, because sometimes policy is just words and doesn't have the resources to back it up. So that's the community. That is what makes us have the joy of living here, and is what will attract people to come back and be here when they live in anonymous places where they're just a name and a number and they don't feel like they have a sense of community. So I appreciate you bringing up that point, because I think it really wraps together so much of what other people were bringing up today. Thank you.
It's a topic we need to be discussing and a topic that our community needs to be involved with. So I'm happy to kind of leave this as the topic to think on and discuss on and bring into your own communities and households and families, and really talk about it and shed light on it. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for hosting. I really appreciate it.
Great. Well, this has been Vermont Voices, viewing national news through a local lens. Have a great night.